G'day everyone, Dan here, and I am one of the programmers that works on the ProPresenter API module in Companion. And I want to do a bit of a longer walkthrough on how you can remote control Companion, specifically how you can remotely push buttons in Companion by sending MIDI notes from ProPresenter through to Companion. Now, natively, Companion supports several options for remote control: TCP, UDP, HTTP, OSC, ArtNet, DMX, and Rosstalk. Wasn't that exciting reading that out? If you are a user of ProPresenter on Mac, you'll know maybe that you can actually use Rosstalk to achieve remote control and remotely push buttons. But Rosstalk is not available for ProPresenter users on Windows. In fact, Windows users of ProPresenter have one option and one option only, and that's MIDI. And unfortunately, MIDI is not in the list, not natively supported. So that is why in the new ProPresenter API Companion module, if you go into the configuration, there is an option to enable MIDI button pushing through a little bit of a hack, a little bit of a workaround, but it works quite elegantly. And I'd like to kind of demo and explore that in this video. Now, before I dive into that, I want to be very clear about how MIDI works and what it looks like. I want to be clear, so I've made a bit of a presentation here. And the first thing I want to point out is that you don't send MIDI from one application to another. Applications send MIDI to a MIDI port, and they can also listen to the MIDI port for any notes that were sent to that port. So just to be clear, if ProPresenter wants to send MIDI notes to Companion, I need a MIDI port that ProPresenter can send notes to and that Companion can listen to. I wish I could modify this diagram a little bit, actually. Maybe I should have drawn a Companion having an ear and listening to the port. So that's how it works. They don't talk directly to each other. There's no such thing as sending MIDI between an application from one app to another. But there is an ability for an application to send MIDI notes to a port and another application to listen to that port for any notes that are sent on it. And you can create ports on your system. You can create as many as you want, actually, and each one can have a name, right? In my demo, I've called W, X, Y, and Z, but you'll probably use much more creative names. And the reason why it might make sense to make multiple ports is you might use them for different applications. So I might use one port that ProPresenter sends MIDI notes to, that Companion is listening to, and that's all that's going through that port. And I might use a whole separate port for another application, maybe a door or something, that's sending notes to that, and maybe some other application is listening, maybe a lighting application, for example. I'm certainly allowed to, any app can send to and listen to any port that it wants. So if you set this up, ProPresenter could be configured with two connections to send MIDI through to this port, which Companion is listening to, or to this port, port Z, that some lighting application is listening to. And in fact, ProPresenter itself can actually listen to MIDI signals and be remotely controlled itself. There's a little section in the settings there where you can do that. So, and if you wanted to, you might set up another port where ProPresenter itself is sending MIDI notes and also listening to that port, and that becomes a kind of a bit of a clever hack or workaround to use MIDI to achieve actions inside ProPresenter that are not easy to do. Right, let's just get going with a simple example. Let's create a single port, then configure ProPresenter to send MIDI notes to it, and configure Companion to listen to it, and then demonstrate what notes we need to send so that we effectively are pushing buttons in Companion. After I do that, I'll do another demonstration. What do we do if this is not on the same computer? So all of this I've been talking about, this port on a computer, what happens when it's on multiple computers? More on that soon. Right, so how do we set up one of these MIDI ports? There's no intrinsic built-in way to do that with Windows. So in Mac OS there's a manager that allows you to create these named MIDI ports. On Windows we need to download some software. And lots and lots of software options to choose from, but perhaps the most popular is by this legend, Tobias Eriksson. And there's several MIDI software that he's got, but these first two are the most interesting. RTP MIDI, this is a network MIDI port. So I can create network MIDI ports that connect to separate computers. So if ProPresenter and Companion are on separate computers, I'll need to use this software to create network ports on both of them and set up a connection between them. If ProPresenter and Companion are on the same computer, I'll use Loop MIDI to create a virtual port that that they can talk to each other on that same computer. So let's demonstrate that first, and then this second. So first things first, I've got Loop MIDI already installed. And let's go into its setup, and we can create those named ports. They're those blue boxes in my slides. We only need one for this demo, so I will first up, before I click plus, actually, I'll give it a name. The default name, I want to give it maybe a more meaningful name. So I'm going to call this Pro-Companion. Maybe, I don't know if that's very meaningful, but I guess I only want to use this port for communication between ProPresenter and Companion, so I've given it, you know, I could have called it Fred Flintstone, I suppose, but I'm trying to give it a meaningful name. Okay, the next thing we'll need to do is configure, so now we've got a port, right? So on that, if I just jump back to that slide, we've created a port, we've given it a name, it's called Pro Companion. Now as long as Loop MIDI software is running, and it runs kind of down in your system tray here, so even if I click X, it's still running. See this black icon, Loop MIDI, still running, and it's default to start, minimized, and to auto start. So as long as it's running, your system now has a named port ready for use. And you know, just a reminder, my single name port is called Pro-Companion. Brilliant. Now the next thing we're going to do is configure ProPresenter to connect to that port and send MIDI notes to it, treat it as a destination, and then tell Companion to listen to it. Now since I've just created the port, bit of a tip, I'm going to need to close off ProPresenter and reopen it. It doesn't really do enumerate ports, MIDI ports live. It just checks at startup. And what I mean by enumerate, do a bit of a roll call. What are the ports that are on this computer? So it kind of does that roll call when it starts up. So if you make any port changes, create any MIDI ports, whether they be these loopback ones or those networked RTP ones later, you'll need to quit and restart ProPresenter. Similarly, with the Companion module, which I'll show you in a minute, same sort of story. Okay, bear with me a few more seconds while my very poor old slow Windows computer starts up. Brilliant. Then just go into settings and go into devices and add a device. We've only got one choice, MIDI. And what you'll have here is the opportunity to treat that port as a port that you listen to. And so ProPresenter calls that a source port. So if I turn that on, ProPresenter will be listening to it as a source. But we don't want to do that. We want to treat that port, Pro Companion, as a destination. As far as ProPresenter is concerned, we want to send MIDI notes to it, but we don't want to listen. Don't want to turn that on. If I turn on both of those, that is that loopback situation that I mentioned earlier. Let me just jump out of the settings. I'll show you what I mean there. That one there. That's something, a bit of a watch out actually. If I see people doing that a little bit, where they add a MIDI port to ProPresenter and they treat it as both a destination that they're sending notes to and a source that they're listening to, and they create this feedback loop. And unless you're doing that intentionally, and you know that you want to send notes to that port that come roaring back into ProPresenter and remote control it, unless you're doing that intentionally, you probably don't want to turn it on as a source as well. Just treat it as a destination. All right, so there's this MIDI port. It's the Pro Companion port that we've created. We're only going to treat it as a destination. ProPresenter is not going to listen to notes. It's just going to send notes to it. Auto reconnect is good. We want that to reconnect every time ProPresenter starts, and we will manually connect it now. So at this point, We've now created that port, and we've now configured ProPresenter to treat it as a destination and connect to it and send to it. So now we just got to do this other half and configure Companion to listen to it. So let's go across to Companion, ProPresenter, and look at the configuration. We need to turn on enable MIDI button pushing. I call it MIDI button pushing. And then you'll need to pick that port name, Pro Companion. Now, if that doesn't appear there, you might have to quit Companion and start it again. Sometimes toggling the module off and on, or sometimes even just hitting save without making a change. But at any rate, you needed to get it to basically discover that new port that you've made, Pro-Companion in my case. Now we're almost done. We enabled it, we've told it which port to listen to, but because this feature uses a bit of a hack, what it does, it actually listens for those MIDI notes, and each time it receives it, it converts it to an HTTP remote call and sends it to Companion. But in order to do that, it needs to know what port your Companion is listening to. And modules do not have permission to query Companion to ask it what the port is. So unfortunately, I have to ask you. I have to ask you to fill that out. So what is your Companion network port? There's two places to spot that. If you're in Companion and you're about to fill it out, glance up to the address bar and look at your port. And that's this bit here. After the address of Companion, the colon, and then your port is there just before the slash. So in my case, it's quadruple 8. I think the default's 8000, so you might find yours is 8000 and you don't need to change it. Another place to look at it is right click on the Companion module and show the window, and there's the port there, which is changeable, by the way. I could change that to 8000 and restart Companion, but what I will do is just put the proper port in that my Companion is using, which is 12348. Be very careful and hit save. Right, so at this point we're done. We've enabled MIDI button pushing. We've told Companion to listen to a MIDI port called Pro Companion, which we created earlier in, no, not in RTP MIDI, in Loop MIDI, Pro-Companion. So Companion will be listening to this port. ProPresenter is configured to send MIDI to that port. And I've got to disconnect it to look at its settings. So it treats that port, Pro-Companion, as a destination, but it doesn't listen. So there's no feedback. So that completes this picture of ProPresenter treating this port that we've created in Loop MIDI as a destination and Companion listening to it. So at this point, we're now ready to kind of demonstrate sending MIDI notes through to Companion to push buttons. So let's do that almost, but before I do that, I want to make it obvious that it's working. And so in order to make it obvious that it's working, I've configured some buttons here where this one is displaying the value of a custom variable that I've called score. And this button has an internal action to update that particular internal variable called score and basically add one to it, surprise, surprise. And would you believe this button here with a minus on it has an action to subtract one from the score, so that when I press these buttons, if I press the plus, I'll see the score increment by 1, and if I press the minus, I'll see the score decrement or go down by 1. And so I did that on purpose, just as a crude way to demonstrate successfully pushing this button in a moment. Now, if we just briefly look at the Docker, default port there. So go to the module, go to these 3 dots, go to the help file that nobody knows exists, and scroll past all the stuff that no one reads, and you'll find some information about the simple MIDI button pusher. So it's an optional feature. You can turn it on. Basically you have to send it note on messages through a shared MIDI port, and that will cause a button press. And it uses very simple mapping, and that very simple mapping is basically the MIDI channel equals the button page, the value or the intensity of the note equals the row of the button. Oh, sorry, the note value. The note value itself equals the row of the button, and the intensity equals the column. And this configuration makes it a little bit easy to, this mapping makes it a little bit easy to quickly pick a button, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment. It does have a limitation though. The MIDI channel is your button page, and MIDI as a protocol only supports 16 channels, so you only get 16 pages. Might change that in the future if there's a large outcry, but hopefully most people can work with only being able to remotely press buttons on the first 16 pages. And the reason for that is if I swap this mapping around to these other ones, move the page to one of these other parts, it removes the 16 page limitation, but introduces a little bit of mental math that I don't think anybody's going to want to do. Whereas in this way, it's a lot less math. Right, so how do you push a button? You need to know the naming scheme of buttons in Companion. And if you just go to the buttons page and rest your mouse on any button, like this one here, it will give you a pop-up tooltip specifying the page and the row and the column. So this is page 2, row 0, column 2. And the rows and columns counting starts at 0. So this first row is row 0. So see the 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And this first column is column 0. And then column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You don't have to commit that to memory. Just rest your cursor on a button that you want to press and see that it's 2, 0, 1. So in order to press this plus, I need to send a MIDI note to 201 effectively. So let's do that. I'm going to send a MIDI note. I'll probably just shuffle things around so we can see ProPresenter. I'm going to add a macro, and we'll call this macro plus, and we'll add a communication action for MIDI, and we're going to we want to send 201. So channel 2, note 0, intensity 1. Notice the notes have their musical names first, but when I say note 0, I mean this index number at the end. So note 0. So 201. Great. So now if I click that button, it'll send that MIDI note through to the port that Companion is listening to, which will convert it to an ACDP button press. And we can see the evidence that that's working. Each time I click that macro button, that plus button is doing its work of incrementing the score. And now I can duplicate that macro, rename it, and call this second one minus, and just hover my cursor over this minus button and remind myself I need to send a MIDI note 2/2/1. So 221. So let's go in and edit that MIDI note and change that to 2, 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1. Great. And that should give me the minus. So that's the plus, and that's the minus. So that's it. That's how to do it with local loop MIDI. That's how to do this between ProPresenter and Companion with a local loop MIDI port. But the next thing I might demonstrate is how to do it between two computers. And that's this here. What happens if ProPresenter is on computer 1 and Companion is on computer 2? Well, as long as they're on the same network, we can use another application called RTP MIDI to set up special ports on both computers that talk to each other over the network via RTP MIDI. And so let's quickly demonstrate that. So with that, I'm going to need to use two Windows computers. and you'll need to install back here with Tobias Ericsson software. That's where this RTP MIDI software comes in handy. Once that's downloaded and installed, run that, and we'll be creating a port again. And the vernacular is a bit different. They call it sessions when it's RTP MIDI, so we'll create that. And the default name is Office NUC, which is the name of this Windows computer I'm on now. You could rename it, and local name is the name that you see looking at the MIDI port from this computer, and Bonjour name is an advertised name that all other instances of RTP MIDI see on other computers on the network. So that's kind of broadcast around the network, and other computers will see this connection as Office NUC. So I'm just going to leave those two the same. That'll be the name of your computer, and I'll just enable that by ticking that section there. So now what's happened is I've now got a port on this computer called Office-NUC, and it's locally called Office NUC, and other computers who run this same software, or Macs who just browse for it, will see it also as Office-NUC. So that's it. I can kind of dismiss that. That runs in the background as a service. And again, we'll go add that port to... Well, in that case, actually, which way will we do this? I don't need ProPresenter anymore, not on this one. What I'll do is add that port to Companion on this side. And notice I said that you won't see it straight away, and I said maybe newly created MIDI ports don't appear in software till you kind of restart it. Sometimes just turning it off and on. Sometimes hitting save. Can help. Yes, that worked. There you go. So there's Office NUC, our new MIDI port. So Pro Companion was our loopback one, offered by Loop MIDI. Office-NUC is our networked port. So let's listen to that. And I might configure this. No, that's fine. I don't know if I need to configure ProPresenter API module. We'll come back to that. I've just quit ProPresenter on this computer, which has caused the module to be upset because it's not running. But I think the MIDI button pushing will still work. We're about to find out live. Okay, so now Companion's listening to this network session that we've created with RTP MIDI called Office NUC. And we're going to jump on another computer and create another RTP MIDI session, connect the two, and run ProPresenter on that computer and send MIDI through that computer through to this MIDI and back here. What I might do is run ProPresenter and show you that slide again. While that's starting up, let me use the power of remote software to quickly zoom across to the second Windows computer and get that RTP MIDI port set up on this end. So it has no ports on its end, but it can see that Office NUC being broadcast and advertised in the broader directory. So we've got to create a port at this end for ProPresenter to use. And the default name will be the name of the computer, and this computer is called TV NUC. Can you guess what I use this for? And the local MIDI port name and the broadcast is fine to leave as default. So go ahead and tick enabled. By the way, you can tick here or here, doesn't matter. And this particular directory session now, I'm going to add it to connect, highlight it and hit connect so that it becomes a participant inside this TV NUC session. So now I've got, this all might sound a bit confusing, I've essentially got a local MIDI port called TV NUC with a network participant called Office NUC at the other end. So any MIDI that an application on this computer sends to the MIDI port called TV NUC will be sent through the magic of RTP MIDI over the network through to this MIDI port, and Companion will be listening to this MIDI port and receive that MIDI note. So let's get ready and start ProPresenter on this end and configure it to send to TV NUC. while that's starting, no, oh, let's just let it start. I'll sit here in slightly awkward silence and remind myself that I wish I had slightly faster NUCs, because it's tad slow to load. Okay, so this is ProPresenter on TV NUC. Just a reminder, we're on TV NUC and we're about to add a MIDI device, and we're going to treat, you can see that port TV NUC, do not treat it as a source, we're going to send to it. So the idea is this ProPresenter on my TV is going to send MIDI notes through to the Office NUC, who's going to receive them, and Companion will be running on that one and be listening for those notes, and we'll be able to push buttons remotely. So go back out, don't forget to hit connect. So now any MIDI, oh look, I've already got a demo one here. I'll just get rid of that macro. We'll start again from scratch. We'll add a new macro and we'll add an action to send to that particular MIDI port a MIDI note on. I can't remember what the notes were that we're meant to send. I think we're meant to send page 2, row 0, column 1, I think was the plus button. We'll find out in a moment. Let's use the magic of remote zoom to flip across to the Office computer, and which is running Companion, and remind ourselves that that note, that plus button, is 201. I'm just going to zoom back into the TV. Did I choose 201? 201. Right, so 201 MIDI note. If we can get it to go across the network and into the Office and into this Office NUC port, then we'll effectively achieve pushing this plus button. The current score is 8. So if we can push it remotely, it'll go up. In fact, let me see if I can get these two computers side by side. We won't flick between them. Let's shrink them down a little bit. I think it'll be a little less confusing if our two computers are side by side, so they can see each other. We can see what's happening. Great. All right, so this one here is a Windows PC I call TV NUC. This is out in the lounge room running my TV entertainment center, but also ProPresenter. And this in the background here is my Office NUC running Companion. And what we've done is set up an RTP MIDI port on this one, on both ends. And this one's called Office NUC. And we've also set up an RTP MIDI port on this one. And he's inherited the name, both of them have inherited the name of the computer. So this one's TV NUC, this one's Office NUC. Then when we saw the opposite end, in the directory, we hit it, we highlighted it and hit connect. We only have to do that once. And now TV NUC MIDI port on this computer is networked to Office NUC MIDI port on this computer. So anything that ProPresenter sends to TV NUC will go through the network through to this MIDI port that Companion is listening to. So all going well, if we send a 201 with this macro here on this computer on the TV NUC, this one, it should flow through and press that button. And excellent, it doesn't. Let's double check that I got that right. 201. Okay, that looks good. Let's double check that the MIDI port is connected. Looks good. Let me look at the configuration. It's connected to TV NUC as a destination. Great. And Companion is configured to listen to Office NUC. Did I save that? Good. The port is quadruple 8. Excellent. Let's try again. Maybe I missed saving that companion. So that's working now. So that's from one computer to another. And of course I could duplicate that and edit the note to hit that button. That's the minus button. And that button is 202. Just if I hover my cursor over it. No, 221. Oh, it's close. I suggest hovering your cursor over it. And that should be the minus. Excellent. We can see evidence that the minus button is working. So that's the plus button. That's the minus button. So that's almost it. One little tip that I will give you. Wherever you're running Companion, make sure when you show the window that the network interface is listening to all interfaces, or at least localhost. Actually, for RTP MIDI across multiple or all interfaces. That's important. If you're configured it to listen to just a specific network adapter, just your wired adapter, or just your wireless, whatever the case may be, this loop back MIDI button pushing won't work. It needs Companion to be listening on all interfaces effectively. Essentially, it needs it to be listening to 127.0.0.1, but you'll need the other interfaces for network purposes. So just all interfaces is the safe bet. That's it. Hope that made sense, and thanks very much.